Introduction to Elizabeth Smart and the American Context of 2002. Let me take you back to the United States in 2002. A time right on the cusp of rapid change, yet still tinted with a sense of innocence that would soon be shattered for many Americans. The world, and especially the country, was still rattled by the aftershocks of the events on September 11, 2001. National security, child safety, and the threats posed by the unknown became hot topics at family dinner tables and on every major news network. Parents across suburbs and cities alike began locking doors more tightly and looking with suspicion at strangers in their neighborhoods. America wanted to believe that home was a safe haven, but that very belief would be shaken to its core when an ordinary family from Salt Lake City, Utah, was thrust into a nightmare. Elizabeth Smart, a name that would soon become engraved in the collective memory of the nation, was only 14 years old at the time, standing at an age balanced between innocence and the beginnings of teenage confidence. Growing up in a well-regarded Mormon family, Elizabeth was considered a model daughter. Musically talented, kind, and clever, she played the harp beautifully and seldom got into trouble. Her parents, Ed and Lois Smart, were upstanding citizens, successful and giving back to their community, residing in a beautiful home in a placid suburb. The Smarts, with their 6 well-mannered children, epitomized the American dream: hard work, religious faith, and a sense of familial warmth and security. But below this tranquil surface, society was grappling with its own set of growing pains. Nationally, the early 2000s saw a surge in crime-related media coverage. Stories about child abductions and stranger danger dominated the screens, amplified by a 24-hour news cycle that had begun to permeate every living room. The Amber Alert system had only been operational for a handful of years in the United States, revolutionizing how law enforcement and citizens could respond when children went missing. Still, there was an underlying hope that tragedies like those on the news could never happen to families like ours. That illusion was violently broken for the Smarts, and for all of America, in June 2002. Overnight, a story of unimaginable fear, resilience, and ultimately, hope would unfold. The kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart didn't just affect one family or one city. It forced the entire country to reflect on what it means to be safe, what it means to have faith in justice, and how far communities will go to protect their own. In the aftermath, Elizabeth would not only survive but become a symbol of courage, perseverance, and hope, a figure whose story helped redefine public awareness of abduction and recovery nationwide. As we dive into the details of this extraordinary case, remember it was set against a backdrop where America was questioning itself, uncertain about its safety nets, and yearning for stories of triumph. The journey of Elizabeth Smart would become one of those rare stories that captured a nation's attention, made neighbors look out for one another, and inspired changes reaching far beyond the borders of Salt Lake City, Utah. The Smart family, a portrait of happiness. Before the storm from the outside looking in, the Smart family was the textbook definition of the American dream. Ed Smart and his wife Lois were known throughout Salt Lake City, not just for their business acumen, but also for the way they conducted themselves with humility and active concern for others. Ed was a real estate and mortgage broker, while Lois managed not just the bustling household, but also participated in community and charity events, embodying the values she passed along to her children. Their success was reflected in their spacious home nestled among an affluent, peaceful neighborhood, where children played in the yard, neighbors kept their gardens tidy, and weekends brought block parties or church gatherings filled with smiles and laughter. Life in the Smart household was rarely chaotic despite the presence of 6 children, an impressive feat by any standard. Elizabeth, as the eldest daughter, was frequently a role model to her siblings. She navigated her teenage years with grace and a maturity that was evident to peers and adults alike. As a family, the Smarts had dinner together nearly every night, sharing stories of their days and supporting each other through academic achievements, musical recitals, and minor playground heartbreaks. What truly set the Smarts apart, however, wasn't the material abundance. They had more than enough of that, from the imposing facade and multiple family vehicles, to the lovingly decorated rooms filled with personalized touches for each child. It was the intangible things, the way Ed would spend hours patiently explaining homework, or Lois sitting cross-legged on the bed helping a younger daughter with her hair before church services. Their Mormon faith formed a bedrock beneath everyday routines, encouraging values like integrity, self-reliance, compassion, and charity that reached far beyond the front yard. Family meetings, nights of prayer, and service projects were as much a part of their calendar as school functions or business deadlines. Elizabeth herself shone in this nurturing environment. Her harp performances were legendary at school concerts and church events. Neighbors marveled at her kindness, her respectful nature, and the obvious affection she had for her younger siblings. She played the dual role of responsible older sister and confidant, always knowing just the right thing to say to cheer up a brother with a scraped knee or a little sister who was struggling at school. The smart home was not only a symbol of prosperity, but also of safety and predictability. Doors weren't locked until bedtime. The kids were allowed to play in nearby woods and parks with little worry, a testament to the perceived security of their surroundings. Strangers were rare, and the idea of a threat lurking in plain sight simply didn't cross anyone's mind. One could hardly imagine a shadow falling over such an idyllic setting, even as unease in the national psyche began to mount elsewhere. To the Smarts, their family was their most treasured possession. Holidays were loud and lively, filled with music and games. Birthdays were extravagant affairs, not for the gifts, but for the family traditions. Pancakes for breakfast, silly hats at dinner, and heartfelt cards exchanged at the end of the day. The warmth found in the Smart household became a magnet, drawing in extended family, friends, and even neighbors who found themselves craving that unshakable sense of belonging. No one, least of all Ed and Lois, could ever have predicted that their bonds of love and trust would be so cruelly tested. Their idyllic slice of American life would soon be shattered, throwing everyone and everything they cherished into stark relief against unimaginable loss. But before tragedy struck, the Smarts were proof that happiness flourished best in homes rooted in love, faith, and a genuine care for the world beyond their doorstep. The fateful night and the heartbreaking abduction. Sometimes, even the safest place can turn into a stage for horror. That's exactly what happened to the Smart family in the early hours of June 5, 2002. The night began in typical suburban tranquility. The house on the East Bench of Salt Lake City was quiet, dark, and to all appearances shielded from the chaos of the outside world. But as midnight passed and the Smart household drifted further into sleep, an unthinkable chain of events was set in motion. Close to 2 a.m., while the air outside was cool and the family lay tucked beneath their covers, an intruder entered through a window, his intentions cold and calculated. Moving with chilling precision, he found his way to the shared bedroom of Elizabeth, then just 14 years old, and her younger sister Mary, age 9. The unwelcome presence was as silent as a ghost, until Elizabeth was startled awake by the gleam of a knife pressed too close to her throat. The stranger's voice, low and fierce, shattered the stillness. "Don't say a word or I'll hurt your whole family." In her young mind, terror and confusion raced, battling the unreality of the moment. Elizabeth, trembling and numb, complied. She slipped on a pair of sneakers, her hands shaking, and followed the man out of her own bedroom, through the halls that had always been her sanctuary, and into the world beyond her front door. The intruder guided her into the darkness, leaving behind the only life she had ever known. As the house remained silent, Mary, petrified, pretended to be asleep, her heart pounding. Only when the terrifying footsteps and the ominous presence had faded did she dare to move, frozen with fear until daylight bled into the room. Back in the secretive hours of that night, Elizabeth was whisked away into the nearby mountains. For the rest of the Smart family, the horror only began to unfold with the sunrise. When Mary, desperate and shaking, ran to her parents' bedroom and told them that Elizabeth was gone, panic erupted. The initial search was frantic but fruitless. Elizabeth had vanished without a sound. The anguished cries, trembling hands, and disbelieving eyes of her parents marked the start of one of the most grueling days of their lives, and the beginning of an ordeal that would captivate and terrify the nation for months to come. That night, everything changed irrevocably. In a matter of minutes, the Smart family's sense of safety, so deeply rooted in faith and routine, was ripped away. What followed for Elizabeth was a journey through unimaginable terror and survival. And for the family, it was the start of a fight not just for their child's return, but for hope itself in the face of absolute darkness. A relentless investigation and a nationwide search wave. The hours after Elizabeth Smart's abduction were a blur of panic and determination. No one in the Smart family or the broader Salt Lake City community could have predicted what they were about to endure. As soon as Mary's trembling voice shattered the quiet of the early morning with her terrifying account, Ed and Lois Smart sprang into action. The police were called without hesitation. Arriving at the house around 4 a.m., and instantly recognizing the urgency of the situation. Within minutes, the smart home, once a symbol of comfort, became a makeshift command center bustling with officers, evidence technicians, and family members desperate for answers. Law enforcement wasted no time. They understood the grim timeline that governed child abduction cases. The first 48 hours are often the most critical. Immediately, detectives began canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing potential witnesses, and inspecting every inch of the smart residence. The Amber Alert system, just a few years into operation in Utah, was triggered. Local news breathlessly broadcast the stunning news. Within hours, the story spread far beyond Salt Lake City, igniting a wave of concern that rippled across the nation. Flyers bearing Elizabeth's photo were rushed to print shops and distributed everywhere, from school hallways to shopping malls and freeway off-ramps. Her face became a somber reminder to parents everywhere that safety could be shattered in a moment. But it wasn't just the professionals who mobilized. Ed and Lois, drawing on their deep roots in the community, reached out to family, friends, and church members, rallying a search effort of unprecedented scale. The extended Smart family, Ed's 6 siblings, Lois's 9, formed the spine of a volunteer network that would soon balloon into the thousands. Parents who had never met the Smarts, motivated by empathy and fear, joined strangers to form search parties, while others provided food, printed banners, or managed information hotlines flooded with desperate tips and rumors. By dawn, the search was well underway. Search teams combed through rugged hillsides and wooded parks, officers were joined by K-9 units, and helicopters swept low over the landscape, scanning for traces of Elizabeth. The Utah desert and mountain terrain posed its own unique challenges. Temperature swings, thick underbrush, steep ravines. Still, not a single clue was left unturned. National and even international organizations, touched by the seriousness of the case, contacted the Smarts offering resources. Some helped set up a website that received millions of hits, while others provided technical expertise for mapping, database work, or media strategy. By the end of the first day, the scope of the search was staggering. More than 1,000 police and volunteers, dozens of helicopters, off-road vehicles, and hundreds of miles of terrain covered. And yet, for all the energy and hope poured into the hunt, there were no real leads. Each fruitless hour deepened the collective anxiety and sorrow. The realization set in that this was unlike any other case Salt Lake City had seen before. National news networks sent anchor teams to report live, politicians issued dramatic statements, and even strangers across the country posted prayers and notes of support on dedicated forums. Yet as days slipped into weeks, hope and unity were threatened by the slow drip of uncertainty. The sheer volume of tips, many misleading, some outright fraudulent, sometimes overwhelmed investigators. The Smarts endured both cruel rumors and heartfelt gestures. Still, their determination never wavered. The community of Salt Lake City, inspired by the Smarts' unyielding faith, continued their search, proving that in the darkest hours, love and solidarity could shine as brightly as a rescue beacon in the night. The first suspects and the investigation, dead end. As the immediate shock began to wear off, and the hours slipped into days, an agonizing uncertainty gripped both the Smart family and the officers leading the case. From the outset, the Salt Lake City Police Department understood that statistically, abductions perpetrated by strangers were rare. Often, perpetrators knew their victims. This led detectives down several complex trails as they tried to untangle a web of possibility and suspicion that constantly shifted under the weight of public scrutiny and familial desperation. In the early stages, attention turned to individuals with past connections to the Smart household. Richard Ricci, a 48-year-old handyman with a checkered past, quickly became suspect number 1. Ricci had previously worked for the Smarts, painting walls and performing odd jobs, and thus knew the home's layout, including where the children slept. His previous criminal record, which spanned decades and included theft, assault, and parole violations, did little to inspire confidence. Moreover, investigators had discovered unexplained mileage on Ricci's vehicle soon after the kidnapping, an anomaly which he could not account for. Suddenly, the entire city eyed him with suspicion. Ricci, however, vehemently denied any involvement, and his alibi was as volatile as his reputation. He was already behind bars for unrelated parole violations, but the circumstantial evidence against him appeared enough to sustain the investigation, for a while. But the Smart case was anything but straightforward. Even as Ricci was interrogated, a second suspect emerged, Brian Ed David Mitchell, a drifter notorious in the area for his erratic behavior and open drug use. Mitchell had also crossed paths with the Smarts in the past, allegedly doing odd jobs and occasionally being spotted around their neighborhood. Witnesses reported seeing a man matching his description lurking in the vicinity of the Smart residence in the days before Elizabeth's disappearance. Still, as leads were followed and alibis checked, Mitchell seemed to wiggle free. No clear evidence directly put him in the house on the night of the abduction. Each dead end began to take its toll. Public frustration mounted, with rumors swirling, conspiracy theories blossoming, and the media magnifying every decision or perceived misstep by law enforcement. With every lead that evaporated, the emotional and psychological strain on the Smart family was compounded by the insinuations that perhaps someone from within their own circle might be to blame. At one point, even Ed and Lois Smart had to undergo polygraph testing, willingly submitting themselves in an attempt to clear the air. Their innocence was confirmed, but the feeling of suspicion lingered uncomfortably in the air, inside and outside their home. The investigation ground on, producing only faint glimmers of hope amid a sea of false leads. Richie died unexpectedly in custody of a brain hemorrhage, taking with him any secrets he might have had, and casting a pall of frustrated finality over one branch of the search. Meanwhile, Brian Mitchell, lacking any direct evidence for an arrest, faded momentarily back into the shadows. The police, burnt out by dead ends and inundated by a deluge of tips, some genuine, some outlandish, many outright fraudulent, felt the pressure mounting daily, as weeks slid toward months. The Smart family was forced to reckon with the possibility that the person responsible might never be brought to light, that Elizabeth's fate could remain forever shrouded in mystery. Similar events and new clue hints. In the swirling aftermath of Elizabeth Smart's disappearance, every possible clue was run down, every outlier examined, and every stone turned. Yet for weeks, it felt as though the world had become stuck on an endless, agonizing loop, rumors giving birth to rumors, leads evaporating into nothingness. But then, almost 2 months after that wrenching June night, something happened that cracked the dark stillness of the investigation and forced old assumptions back into the light. A near-identical attempt was made on another young girl in the Smarts' extended circle, and for the first time, investigators wondered if they had missed a crucial pattern all along. The girl in question was Jessica, Elizabeth's first cousin. Like Elizabeth, Jessica was young, bright, and accustomed to the rhythms of family safety and suburban predictability. Late one night, while most of her household slept, she awoke to the unmistakable sound of movement at her bedroom window. At first, perhaps, it could have been a tree limb tapping or the noisy night wind, but as she lay still, her heart in her throat, she saw the outline of a figure, tall and thin, lurking outside. The stranger's hand pressed against the glass. The familiarity of fear flooded her body, a fear described to her by relatives, seen on news reports, but never truly understood until it arrived on her own doorstep. Jessica, unlike her cousin, managed to jolt herself into action. She dashed from her bed with a burst of adrenaline, fleeing down the hallway to rouse her parents, her small hands trembling as she tried to find her voice. By the time an adult stormed into the room, the figure outside had vanished, absorbed once more by the darkness enveloping so many homes that summer. But in those fleeting seconds, a chilling similarity had been revealed. Whoever had stolen Elizabeth wasn't just a faceless, one-time predator. He was local, bold enough to strike again, and most disturbingly, he may have been following a pattern that put other girls in the Smart family or perhaps their neighborhood directly at risk. The attempted abduction sent shockwaves through the investigative teams, still reeling from so many false starts. Suddenly, the possibility arose that the earlier focus on isolated suspects may have blinded authorities to a more nuanced, opportunistic danger. The press latched onto the story, speculation running wild through Salt Lake City. Had Jessica nearly become the next Elizabeth? Was the perpetrator fixated on the Smart family specifically, or was he simply emboldened by having gotten away the first time around? This new incident forced a re-examination of everything: timelines, alibis, tips previously dismissed as irrelevant. Investigators began to scrutinize individuals who might have had prolonged observation of both girls' routines. The realization dawned that perhaps the person they were seeking possessed intimate knowledge of the family's schedules, household layouts, and a sense of when their guard would be most likely down. It was a haunting prospect, suggesting the attacker wasn't just a shadowy outsider, but perhaps a local with connections nobody had yet pieced together. It was also at this juncture that police began to give renewed attention to any employees, contractors, or even casual acquaintances who had legitimate reasons to be near both homes. Interviews were repeated, Old case files were dusted off and scrutinized once more with fresh urgency. A new list of persons of interest emerged, some previously cleared because their connection had seemed too tenuous, or because their alibis had checked out only at the margins. The paranoia in the community spiked. Neighborhood watches intensified, parents doubled their vigilance, and church groups organized supervision like never before. For Jessica and her family, relief at her narrow escape quickly gave way to a lingering sense of violation. Windows were locked during the day and night. Parents huddled over their children's beds at bedtime, promising safety they no longer believed in. Meanwhile, the Smart family's despair found new companionship in anger. How could the person responsible remain so close, so uncatchable? How could they walk among their victims' loved ones with impunity? The reverberations of Jessica's ordeal stretched still further. Other families in Salt Lake City, and even across other corners of Utah, stepped forward to report similar near misses or instances of strangers lurking near windows in the weeks and months since Elizabeth vanished. Some stories proved credible and forced the authorities to expand their map of possible crime scenes. Others collapsed under the weight of rumor-mongering and collective fear. But one thing was now clear. Elizabeth's case was not a tragic one-off, and danger was not easily contained or understood. This new lead galvanized the investigation, prompting a mix of hope and dread as law enforcement began to believe a breakthrough might be at hand. The sense of urgency that followed was different now, layered with the knowledge that a missed detail could mean another tragedy. Every patrol car was on high alert, every officer briefed on the evolving threat profile. Experts on serial offenders, previously deemed unnecessary, were consulted and brought in to help draft behavioral composites. Community awareness events, straddling the line between vigilance and hysteria, multiplied. On the forensic side, evidence collected from Jessica's attempted abduction site underwent meticulous analysis. Soil samples, fingerprints, shoe prints left in the garden under her window, all were compared to the scant materials collected from Elizabeth's disappearance. Although nothing definitive surfaced in the short term, the very act of searching revealed a procedural tenacity that inspired hope and painted a picture of a police force bent on redemption after early missteps. Despite the swelling optimism, the case didn't break open in the immediate aftermath. The reality of such investigations, as families across America painfully learned that summer, is that even the most promising leads can fade away, or remain tantalizingly just out of reach. Yet there was no denying the psychic shift Jessica's near miss triggered. It forced both the authorities and the public to accept an uncomfortable truth. Evil could be both methodical and persistent, and sometimes, it needed to be fought not just with police procedure, but with community unity and undiminished resolve. Ultimately, the attempted abduction of Jessica reignited the search for Elizabeth, breathing new urgency and discipline into the process. Old files were reread with new eyes, timelines reconstructed and checked against fresh tip-offs. Elizabeth's photograph, already ubiquitous, became a symbol not only of one girl's ordeal, but of a community's struggle to reclaim innocence, and of the hope that maybe resolution lay just one revelation away. Involvement of criminal psychological experts and new analysis. When the investigation into Elizabeth Smart's abduction seemed to be looping endlessly with no firm answers, the Smart family, drained but unbroken, realized that hope might rest in seeing the mystery through a different lens. By early fall, as days stretched into months, the Salt Lake City police had amassed a towering file built on routine detective footwork. Interviews with hundreds of possible witnesses, boxes stuffed with dead-end leads, call logs, tips from the public numbering in the tens of thousands. Yet, Elizabeth was still missing, her abductor unaccounted for. The climate was heavy, not only with familial heartbreak, but a kind of investigative fatigue, the worrisome sense that each day without a resolution diminished the odds of ever finding her alive. It was at this crossroads, where traditional detective work had seemingly failed, that Ed and Lois Smart pressed for outside expertise. They wanted to bring in a seasoned criminal profiler. The move was bold, even unconventional at the time, but their determination and community backing left authorities little choice. That's how Dr. John Lee, a pseudonym that nonetheless became widely recognized in subsequent media, entered the frame, carrying with him a reputation forged at the intersection of forensic psychology, behavioral analysis, and real-world abduction rescues. Dr. Lee's approach felt simultaneously clinical and deeply human. He began by re-examining every scrap of the seemingly tired evidence with a fresh set of eyes and a different set of questions. Where beat detectives focused on logistics like time, means, and opportunity, Dr. Lee was searching for psychological patterns, behavioral tells, invisible threads woven by the kidnapper's mind. He wanted to understand the person behind the act, not just the act itself. Dr. Lee spent days combing through case files, victimology, and the narrative timeline, looking for holes or inconsistencies, and personally interviewing not only police and family but also neighbors who'd previously slipped past the notice of law enforcement. He wasn't seeking raw data, he was searching for texture, for nuance, for what others had dismissed as noise, but he suspected might be signal. By mid-October, Dr. Lee began to draw a composite that differed starkly from the popular assumptions. He hypothesized that the abductor was not a passing stranger, but someone with intimate knowledge of the Smart household. A tall, slender male, likely in his 40s or 50s, who had performed work in or around the home before. He suggested that the abductor was comfortable moving around the neighborhood unnoticed, even confident enough to approach the house on foot rather than by car, suggesting a local. Lee also theorized that the abductor was likely to have spent significant time watching, learning routines, and carefully planning the crime, a calculated risk-taker with a measure of religious delusion, a detail based on unsettling bits of language reported by Mary and other witnesses. While detectives paused, weighing Lee's risk profile against their stack of mostly dead suspects, he pushed them to re-interview families who'd hired temporary workers, landscapers, handymen, or household help within the past year. Dr. Lee urged for less tunnel vision around original suspects like Richard Ricci, who, while initially plausible due to criminal history, didn't fit the psychological blueprint Lee constructed. Instead, he asked them to focus on outlier personalities who drifted into the Smarts' lives, perhaps under the radar because they seemed strange but not threatening, or because they outwardly referenced God or destiny. He highlighted the need to plumb religious gatherings and outreach programs, especially fringe ones, for unknown hangers-on. As Dr. Lee dug deeper, his psychological portrait began to ripple through the entire investigation. Officers who'd grown used to certain patterns of thinking were forced out of their comfort zones. New briefings centered on his analyses. Did anyone overhear odd religious rhetoric in the community? Had anyone expressed messianic delusions or talked of visions, especially regarding the purity or purpose of young girls? Had neighbors reported anyone loitering with a glazed, dissociative air about them? These questions, at first dismissed as esoteric, quickly gained relevance. Parents grew even more vigilant, and some reported new memories, vague perhaps, but now shadowed by suspicion in the light Dr. Lee cast. Perhaps most powerfully, Dr. Lee reinterpreted Mary's fragmentary memories from the night of the abduction. Where police heard a frightened child's incomplete account, Dr. Lee heard telltale hallmarks of manipulation, rehearsal, and ritual. He suspected the perpetrator had rehearsed the crime, possibly even staged dry runs, and that Mary's impression of the abductor as commanding yet not physically forceful might indicate a reliance on psychological intimidation or spiritual authority rather than brute violence. This nuanced reading reframed the entire trajectory of the investigation. Another breakthrough came from Dr. Lee's insistence on re-examining the environment. He walked the perimeter of the Smart home and adjacent properties, scrutinizing hiding places, vantage points, and escape routes. He pointed out how the abductor would need confidence not just in his plan, but in his ability to move through the local terrain after dark, reinforcing the idea that the suspect was intimately familiar with the neighborhood's geography, possibly someone who had spent nights there before, unhindered, perhaps as a transient worker, or even a homeless person who'd been quietly tolerated by the community's charities. With Dr. Lee's help, the police returned to analyze local records and photo arrays, this time emphasizing males with religious overtones attached to their histories, those who had offered to perform yard work or handyman tasks under the guise of faith-based charity. More importantly, they reopened previously closed threads. Neighbors were asked again about their memories, including about people long gone but who had made strong or strange impressions. Officers brought in experts on fringe religious sects to cross-reference with known itinerants who might have moved through Salt Lake City in recent years. Dr. Lee even consulted with behavioral units from the FBI, adding extra hands to sift the burgeoning mountain of psychological evidence. In tandem, Dr. Lee collaborated with Elizabeth's parents on public awareness strategies. He suggested changes in the wording of press releases, press conferences, and even missing persons flyers, arguing that certain religious references or coded language might provoke a reaction from the abductor or trigger memories in bystanders who'd brushed shoulders with the man. The Smarts began highlighting subtle details, references to spiritual missions, peculiar speaking styles, the possibility of a biblical name or title, which, amplified by the media's reach, finally struck a chord with previously unreachable witnesses. Perhaps the most monumental effect of Dr. Lee's intervention was the reviving of public hope in a case many had begun to consider unsolvable. The focus on psychological nuance refueled the media's interest, but, more crucially, redirected the narrative. Elizabeth's case was not lost to random evil, but to a human mind, a mind that could be mapped, anticipated, and countered. Flyers circulated again, now including not just an image but behavioral cues. The search, dormant in places, reignited as law enforcement officers, volunteers, and even amateur sleuths set about examining their memories under Lee's psychological framework. The new approach bore fruit faster than anticipated. Whereas months had produced only rumors, now callers phoned in specific names. A former handyman who claimed to receive visions, a wiry man in late middle age calling himself Emmanuel, who had gone door to door offering yard work and religious tracts. Several residents remembered him distinctly, his mesmerizing, oddly fervent tone, his tendency to recite scripture alongside mundane conversation, his ability to disappear and reappear unpredictably around the neighborhood. By late autumn, the Smart family, working in concert with Dr. Lee and the authorities, commissioned a forensic artist to compose a new, sharply realized sketch based on the evolving behavioral profile and Mary's now strengthened recollections. This time, the face on the posters felt chillingly real, not a generic criminal, but a human with unsettling religious fervor etched in his features. It was cathartic for Mary, who slowly reclaimed fragmented images and sounds from her memory. Each sketch session gave her back a piece of power she'd lost in the shadow of trauma. The breakthrough catalyzed a surge of new leads. Among the most critical came from people who, inspired by the new poster, remembered seeing Emmanuel, later known to be Brian David Mitchell, traveling with a female companion in the days around Elizabeth's disappearance. These witnesses hadn't reported earlier, believing their recollections too vague or unrelated, but Dr. Lee's profile made apparently disparate sightings snap into place. At last, detectives felt their work taking shape, each new witness report a thread, finally weaving into a net. Perhaps unexpectedly, the profiler's involvement also gave the Smart family a renewed sense of agency. No longer just victims waiting for news, they became collaborators, asking sharper questions, spearheading public awareness, and bolstering the investigation through their resilience and grace under pressure. The shift was palpable. Hope, grounded now in psychological insight as much as prayer, permeated every strategy session and community meeting. Dr. Lee's influence would continue long after the Smart case. His multidisciplinary, person-focused approach, melding criminal psychology, victim advocacy, and communal mobilization, marked a turning point not just for this story, but for how high-profile abduction cases were handled in the United States for years to come. A desperate effort and a nationwide plea. By the time autumn arrived in Salt Lake City, the Smart family's fight for Elizabeth's safe return had become a relentless marathon, equal parts organized frenzy and emotional endurance test. While investigators hunted leads and pored over evidence, it was the desperate, unyielding campaign led by Ed and Lois Smart that truly stunned the nation. Their determination turned a singular family tragedy into a touchstone for national unity, shaking up the conventions of how America responded to missing children, and forcing everyone, from average households to government leaders, to confront the true cost of uncertainty and loss. In those days, every morning for the Smarts began with phone calls, media messages, and barely digested news about the endlessly shifting investigation. Ed and Lois, wrung out but unwilling to pause, carved out their daily rituals around interviews with local TV anchors and urgent meetings with police. Tension hung like static in the house. Each meal was interrupted by breaking news or the latest rumor from the community. The phone never stopped ringing. While some calls offered support or tips, far too many delivered only cruel hoaxes, wild theories, or even accusations. The stress was constant, yet the Smarts held on to the notion that their best hope lay in the public's hands. Some ordinary person, somewhere, might know something critical without realizing it. Recognizing this, Ed Smart made a choice that would define the coming months. The case would not disappear into the shadows, and their daughter's story would not be relegated to the back pages. Instead, it was to be kept at the front of the national conversation. Supported by extended family, church members, and volunteers drawn from every slice of the Salt Lake community, the Smarts launched a tireless awareness campaign, a blend of old-fashioned grassroots effort and modern media savvy. Their home became a headquarters. Massive stacks of missing posters, all showing Elizabeth's gentle smile, were shipped nationwide. Distribution points popped up at every gas station, supermarket, and public gathering place, each staffed by volunteers working in shifts. But paper alone could not match the frenzied speed of 21st-century information. Ed and Lois leveraged national television, making heart-wrenching appeals on morning shows, nightly news, and even specialized true crime programs. Ed stood before cameras, shaken, dignified, and fiercely determined, pleading with the nation. "If anyone out there has seen Elizabeth, please do not be afraid to come forward. You may be the one who brings our daughter home." As the family's message moved through cable news tickers and across the burgeoning internet, something extraordinary began to happen. Tips and calls flooded in not only from Utah and neighboring states, but from as far as the East Coast and southern border. Volunteers offered up their skills. Tech experts set up a dedicated website and online contact forms that, at the peak, processed thousands of new messages per day. Search teams expanded their radius, sometimes driving overnight to chase down a credible-sounding lead. At one point, an airline pilot flew in on his own time just to organize air searches over remote mountainous terrain. The sense of urgency leapt beyond geography. Elizabeth's disappearance was no longer just a local or even state-level concern, it had become a national lightning rod. Candlelight vigils cropped up spontaneously in cities from Seattle to Miami. Church groups, schools, and scout troops sent letters and care packages addressed to Elizabeth's family, Salt Lake City. The color yellow, symbolizing hope and the safe return of a lost child, began appearing, tied around trees and worn as ribbons, on thousands of people from coast to coast. Meanwhile, behind their public composure, Ed and Lois grappled with the darkest parts of their ordeal. Every Mother's Day, every birthday, each family milestone arrived with Elizabeth conspicuously absent. The fear that the search might drag on endlessly, that their daughter's face would fade into the endless scroll of unsolved missing persons cases, haunted their quietest moments. Yet the Smart family refused to let the investigation go cold. They alternated between hope and despair, but kept moving, empowered, to an extent, by the knowledge that their suffering had galvanized an entire country. Law enforcement felt the weight of this vast national attention. The case was never far from the headlines, which meant every potential slip or delay drew immediate scrutiny. For the officers, the challenge was twofold. They had to process the relentless wave of public tips, and contend with the reality that a single mistake might echo in primetime news. The FBI, already involved, ramped up their resources, setting up hotlines, reviewing surveillance footage from across multiple states, and dispatching agents for on-the-ground follow-ups. Community leaders and politicians publicly urged for unity and vigilance, citing Elizabeth's case as a wake-up call to the dangers lurking even in the safest-seeming neighborhoods. As the epicenter of the search, Salt Lake City became a town transformed. Billboards flashed Elizabeth's image. Local news ran countdowns, days since Elizabeth vanished, like a grim ticker. Block after block, search parties scoured backyards, ravines, abandoned construction sites, and remote cabins. Police dogs and helicopters became common sights. A scrappy, self-organized network of amateur sleuths began mapping sighting reports from across the country, hoping to find a pattern law enforcement might have missed. The Smart family, ever cautious but deeply appreciative, coordinated closely with local pastors, school principals, and journalists, trying to strike a delicate balance between hope and realism, faith and heartbreak. Emotionally, the collective anxiety of the community was palpable. Parents locked windows and checked on their children at night, conscious that the safety net they'd always assumed was secure had proved heartbreakingly fragile. Conversations at grocery stores or school pickup lines invariably circled back to the central, unanswerable question: how does someone vanish into thin air? At vigils, voices grew hoarse from prayer, anger, and the exhausted demand for answers. To maintain the campaign's momentum, the Smarts adapted quickly to changing circumstances. When a rush of false rumors about Elizabeth's whereabouts surfaced, each one torture for the family, they responded calmly and compassionately, never turning their pain against the crowd of helpers. When conspiracy theories began swirling on talk radio and internet message boards, Ed and Lois made a point of publicly thanking the community for their vigilance. but gently reminded everyone to trust only confirmed information and follow the investigators' guidance. With every additional week, further layers of activism surfaced. For younger siblings still at home, Elizabeth's absence forced them to grow up quickly. Some even recorded video messages for their sister, broadcast nationally as both plea and balm. Extended family traveled in from out of town, taking turns manning phone banks or delivering missing posters across counties. Local businesses donated food and supplies to keep search efforts alive. Each act, however small, wove into a larger tapestry of resilience and heartbreak, a testament to the family's unwavering commitment and to the nation's refusal to give up on one of its own. By the end of fall, the Find Elizabeth Smart movement had imprinted itself on the American psyche. Though the weight of hope was sometimes hard to bear, each new dead end producing fresh waves of grief, the mission persisted. Ed and Lois remained, in all public appearances, paradoxically both vulnerable and resolute. Their willingness to share their rawest fears and enduring love for Elizabeth humanized their story, inviting strangers from across the country to share in their vigil. In the darkest, most uncertain hours, that national chorus grew only louder. Letters poured in, sometimes with only a few dollars taped inside, accompanied by notes reading, "Use this for your search." Local children traced drawings of Elizabeth, some left on the Smarts' porch in the middle of the night, a touching sign that in crisis, compassion lives at the simplest, most fundamental levels. Ed and Lois kept every card, every ribbon, every teddy bear, silent reminders that even in the depths of fear, love remained their guiding force. And for all the anguish and exhaustion, it was that outpouring of compassion from the public, of diligence from law enforcement, and of steadfastness at home that kept the hope for Elizabeth's return alive. Through their tireless campaign, the Smarts inspired lasting changes to how authorities and ordinary people responded to child abductions. National legislation around Amber Alerts gained momentum. In interviews years later, both Ed and Lois would insist that the real legacy of their desperate efforts was their realization that, in a moment of crisis, the simple act of standing together could mean the difference between despair and rescue. Although the search for Elizabeth stretched on into the new year, the country refused to lose faith, a testament not just to a missing girl, but to the enduring power of community, hope, and collective resolve when faced with the unthinkable. The turning point. Mary's memory and the unmasking of a suspect. After months of searching, heartbreak, and relentless advocacy, the case finally shifted thanks to a seemingly small but pivotal breakthrough hiding within the Smart family's own home. This turning point was set in motion by the most unexpected source, Mary Smart, Elizabeth's younger sister. Until this point, the investigation had been a litany of dashed hopes, suspects arrested and released, sightings proven false, and agony stretching out across countless sleepless nights. The stress fractured the family, scarred the city, and exhausted law enforcement, yet hope had always rested on the possibility that someone had seen something, heard a phrase, noticed a face, or remembered a detail that investigators had missed in the emotional chaos of the first days. Mary had witnessed her sister's abduction firsthand on that terrible June night. But trauma warped her memories. Fear, guilt, and the desperate scramble for safety left her mind a fog of half-formed impressions and fleeting, nightmarish images. However, as the summer turned to fall and the Smart family, aided by counselors and a supportive community, gently encouraged Mary to revisit that night, the fog began to clear. Assisted by professional child psychologists, Mary participated in structured memory recovery sessions. Instead of pressuring her for details, therapists created a safe and nurturing environment where Mary could speak freely or offer details only as she felt ready. As weeks passed, tiny slivers of recollection emerged. Mary remembered that her sister's kidnapper had a distinct presence, his voice, his smell, the gentle yet menacing way he ordered them to be quiet. Most importantly, she was able to recall the name he had used, Emmanuel. This detail, a single spoken word from the abductor during those tense moments in the girl's bedroom, immediately caught the investigators' attention. The name, Emmanuel, triggered faint recognition in the family. Ed and Lois Smart racked their memories, combing through past acquaintances and anyone who'd worked odd jobs for the family. After intensive dialogue, the Smarts connected Emmanuel with a drifter they'd hired months before to do yard work, a peculiar, deeply religious man who spoke at length about his visions and beliefs, and who carried himself with both humility and intensity. He had introduced himself simply as Emmanuel. With renewed urgency, the Smart family took the lead. Instead of waiting for the wheels of the official investigation to grind forward, they commissioned a forensic artist to draw a sketch based on Mary's evolving memories, family input, and the recollections of neighbors. This new composite was strikingly different from previous ones, no longer a generic suspect, but an unforgettably intense face. The resulting image was compelling enough that the Smarts and their supporters plastered it on posters, websites, church bulletins, cable news programs, and every corner store in Salt Lake City. They also put out a nationwide appeal, appearing on broadcast media to retell the developing memory and show the sketch to millions. The poster bore fruit almost immediately. Tips flooded in from near and far. Most crucially, a breakthrough came from a woman named Debbie Mitchell, who recognized the suspect as her own brother, Brian David Mitchell. She was joined by Mitchell's stepdaughter and other relatives, who reluctantly confirmed that the man in the sketch and Emmanuel were one and the same. Their collective testimony, combined with Mary's revived memories, broke the case open in an instant. For police, it was the missing link, a known individual tied directly to the family and matching behavioral patterns developed by the criminal profilers. Mitchell's backstory unfolded rapidly. His history of religious fanaticism, itinerant lifestyle, and pattern of ingratiating himself to families with offers of odd jobs. His wife, Wanda Barzee, was quickly identified as a possible accomplice. She'd been noted in prior sightings but discounted as harmless. Armed with the composite sketch, police rapidly connected disparate sightings and reports from across Utah. Recently, several witnesses had reported a man and a young girl dressed in strange veil-like clothing hitchhiking near northern Salt Lake. These were quickly cross-referenced and verified by photo lineups, a process greatly aided by national media exposure. Meanwhile, the Smart family was thrust into a whiplash of new hope and anxiety. Public attention, reignited by the breakthrough, brought a fresh wave of compassion, along with the old dangers of unfounded rumors and false alarms. Yet there was no denying that after 9 agonizing months the tide had finally turned. Now police, FBI agents, and volunteers were operating with a razor-sharp focus. All energies turned toward tracking down the newly identified suspects. Mary, while still burdened by trauma, felt a measure of relief. Her bravery and willingness to face the darkest moments of her memory had cracked open a case so many had started to believe would never be solved. Caring friends, counselors, and family members rallied around her. Empowered by the news, the Smarts appeared in interviews across the country to thank supporters and urge vigilance. "No detail is too small, no memory too faint," Lois Smart declared. "We know now that hope is sometimes found in the remembering." The successful identification of Brian David Mitchell marked the point where tragedy and hope collided, reminding everyone that in the most desperate circumstances, the smallest threads of memory might weave the way toward a miracle. A rescue that made the entire country tremble. The rescue of Elizabeth Smart remains one of the most extraordinary events in the history of American criminal cases, not just because of its miraculous outcome, but because of the raw, nerve-wracking uncertainty and the cascade of emotions it unleashed across the entire country. By March 2003, 9 months had elapsed since that harrowing June night. While hope persisted in the Smart family and their community, few could have imagined how swiftly and dramatically the case would resolve when fate and relentless determination finally converged. It was an ordinary afternoon in Sandy, Utah, just 20 miles from the Smart family home, when 2 local residents spotted a trio walking awkwardly down State Street, a tall, bearded man in layers of strange patchwork robes, a haggard woman in mismatched garments trailing behind, and, sandwiched between them, a young girl, her face partially hidden by a dirty gray veil. While odd-looking, nothing about them screamed, "Most Wanted." Many had seen the trio around town before, always moving, always silent, always holding an unsettling distance from anyone who made eye contact. But this time something triggered the suspicions of one passerby. The girl's eyes, barely visible through her headscarf, sparked a memory. A missing persons poster encountered at a grocery store, a newscast watched with family weeks before. The resident dialed 911, describing the trio and voicing a quiet hope. Could this be the missing Smart girl? Police arrived quickly but chose to exercise caution. The world had learned from bitter experience that abduction cases could collapse at the most crucial moment. Any false move, any sign of public commotion, could scatter suspects or traumatize a possible victim. 4 officers approached the trio in the parking lot of a local strip mall, As they closed in, they asked the adult man and woman about the young girl's identity. The man, later confirmed to be Brian David Mitchell, insisted her name was Augustine and that she was his daughter. The woman, Wanda Barzee, remained stone-faced, muttering quietly beneath her breath. Throughout it all, the girl at their side didn't speak. She looked at the ground, trembling, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. One officer, suspecting they had found Elizabeth Smart, drew close and asked gently, "Is your name Elizabeth?" The girl didn't answer. She seemed paralyzed by fear, shackled to her captors not just by physical proximity, but by months of psychological conditioning. Elizabeth, in that instant, was wrestling with a paralyzing dilemma: fear for her family's safety. Her abductor had always warned her that if she spoke out, her loved ones would die. Fear about the outside world, and a flickering, fragile hope that her ordeal might finally end. Several times the officers asked variations of the same question, always soft but insistent. Each time her captors grew more agitated. The tension in the spring air was almost unbearable. Meanwhile, back at the Smart residence, the phone rang. A detective's voice, careful but trembling with urgency, asked Lois Smart if she could come to Sandy to help identify someone, a girl who might be Elizabeth. Lois, her heart thumping, grabbed Ed, and together they raced down the highway, daring not to hope, but unable to banish the thought. Could it truly be her? At the Sandy precinct, the standoff reached its peak. The officers, drawing on their training and their own intuition, changed tactics. They gently asked the girl personally if she wanted to go home. One word, spoken through tears nearly inaudible, eventually slipped out. Yes. That was all it took. The officers separated Elizabeth from Mitchell and Barzee, taking her into protective custody. One policewoman wrapped a protective arm around her, whispering that she was safe now. Elizabeth, gaunt and exhausted, barely able to process the reality, was finally free from the shadow that had haunted her for nearly a year. When Lois and Ed Smart arrived, their reunion was nothing short of transcendent. Elizabeth was pale, traumatized, and barely recognizable beneath the grime, her hair matted, her eyes haunted, but she was alive. The family embraced, sobbing, the room echoing with a grief and relief so profound it seemed to silence time. News spread in a matter of minutes. After 273 days of darkness, Elizabeth Smart was finally coming home. News of the rescue hit Salt Lake City, and the country, like a lightning bolt. Reporters, neighbors, and strangers wept openly as breaking news alerts lit up television screens from coast to coast. Candlelight vigils that had become quiet rituals of remembrance transformed instantly into celebrations of hope and astonishment. Radio stations interrupted programming to share the news. Schoolchildren and teachers gathered for spontaneous prayers and cheers. The mayor of Salt Lake issued a statement expressing thanks not only to law enforcement, but to every citizen who never gave up. But the celebration was tinged with disbelief. How had Elizabeth survived? What had she endured? The nation watched as medical teams ushered her into a hospital where she was assessed for malnutrition, exposure, and psychological trauma. Her hair was cut unevenly, she was severely underweight, and her skin bore the signs of months spent outdoors and in captivity. Reporters, desperate for answers, pressed authorities and family for details. Wisely, the Smarts and police shielded Elizabeth from the media circus, insisting that her healing and privacy were paramount. For the Smart family, the events of that day were nearly surreal. The home, once filled with sorrow, now echoed with laughter and prayer of gratitude. Elizabeth, still in shock, reunited with her siblings and began the slow, painful process of sharing, not just the horrors, but also the strange mixture of hope and faith that had sustained her. The neighborhood swarmed with reporters, flowers, cards, and well-wishers. Every news anchor, from local affiliates to national outlets, paused with emotion as the story unfolded in real time. In the days that followed, details slowly emerged about the rescue. The role of vigilant citizens, the residents who recognized Elizabeth and called the police, was universally lauded. Law enforcement, previously criticized for missed leads early in the investigation, were now hailed as heroes for their caution and compassion. Most of all, the Smart family's determination, their refusal to surrender hope even when reason seemed to demand it, became a model for families everywhere facing unimaginable loss. Elizabeth's rescue rippled far beyond Utah. Across the country, other families of missing children found comfort and renewed courage. Lawmakers cited the case in debates over Amber Alerts and early intervention protocols, vowing that no child's disappearance should ever be met with indifference or bureaucracy. Survivors of trauma wrote letters to Elizabeth expressing solidarity and encouragement. For a moment, in the wake of terror, the country rediscovered a shared humanity, united by relief, joy, and awe at one young woman's survival. In the aftermath, as the adrenaline faded, more complicated emotions rose to the surface. Questions about guilt and survival, the scars, both visible and unseen, that Elizabeth carried, and how she would rebuild her sense of self, all loomed large. Yet those who met her in the following weeks described not a broken young woman, but someone radiating extraordinary resilience. The rescue itself became a case study in law enforcement, trauma psychology, and even faith. Analyzing what worked, a combination of public awareness, media mobilization, relentless family advocacy, and ultimately, the courage of everyday people, offered inspiration for future cases. Elizabeth's composure in public appearances, in time, not immediately, was striking. She thanked the larger community, spoke openly about the importance of never giving up on others, and asked that the spotlight shift from her ordeal to systemic improvements for all missing children. The story of her rescue closed one tragic chapter for the Smart family and the nation but opened another. A new conversation about safety, hope, and the power of determined collective action. In the decades since, the rescue of Elizabeth Smart remains proof that even in the darkest moments the possibility of a miracle remains real. Extraordinary survival and psychological recovery journey. Elizabeth Smart's recovery journey after her rescue was nothing short of extraordinary, echoing far beyond the borders of her home and into the consciousness of a nation still awash in shock and relief. The story America had followed with fear, hope, and breathless anticipation had finally reached its long-awaited turning point, but the end of captivity was, in truth, the beginning of an entirely different struggle, a struggle not against external danger, but against the scars left on the mind and soul. When Elizabeth was first brought home, everything should have been perfect, a reunion celebrated, a family restored. Instead, the Smart household was plunged into a quieter, more invisible crisis. Elizabeth had spent nearly 9 months in a terrifying world defined by unpredictability, manipulation, deprivation, and constant psychological torment. The wounds were deep. Her captors had sought not just to isolate her from the world but to warp her sense of self, her faith in others, and her basic ability to perceive safety. Those who loved her soon realized that healing would require as much courage as survival, and perhaps even more patience. Immediate aftermath, trauma and re-entry. The first phase of recovery can be summed up as survival within survival. Elizabeth faced a rush of urgent decisions, police interviews, medical checkups, therapy appointments, and a media onslaught that threatened to engulf her every move. Medical professionals noted the physical hallmarks of prolonged captivity: malnutrition, exhaustion, stress-induced ailments. Yet doctors and psychologists quickly pointed out that the psychological trauma loomed even larger. Elizabeth, like many survivors of abduction and long-term abuse, struggled with insomnia, hypervigilance, nightmares, and the intrusive memories of her ordeal. The Smart family home was transformed into both fortress and sanctuary. Protective efforts were ramped up to shield Elizabeth from invasive questions, random visitors, and the ever-present news cameras behind each hedgerow. Family members reorganized their lives around the rhythms required for healing: short, soft conversations, shared quiet meals, and long hours spent simply being together in the same room offering unspoken support. What they learned, often painfully, was that trauma recovery defies timetables. Some days Elizabeth was able to speak calmly and even laugh. Other moments she crumpled under waves of remembered fear or shame. Each small milestone, like sleeping a full night without fear, or leaving the house with her mother, became a cause for celebration. Therapeutic interventions and post-traumatic growth. Elizabeth's path forward was shaped by a multidisciplinary approach. Leading psychologists in trauma and childhood development joined her care team, creating a plan that prioritized her agency and dignity at every stage. She engaged in trauma-informed counseling, which focused on helping her process overwhelming emotions without being forced to relive the darkest experiences. Techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, were gradually introduced, with special attention paid to reducing triggers and anxiety attacks. One of the most significant shifts for Elizabeth was learning to regain control. For months, every moment of her life had depended on her captor's whims. Now, her therapists and family helped her reclaim small but vital pieces of personal autonomy. Seemingly minor choices, what to wear, who to trust, whether to share a memory or keep it private, became meaningful victories. Over time, hope re-entered her vocabulary. While the ordeal haunted her dreams, Elizabeth proved remarkably resilient. Therapists and family noted her resolve, her determination not to let the abduction define her entire life story. There were setbacks, of course, panic attacks, bouts of isolation, days when news reports or random strangers' questions reopened old wounds. But there were also moments of laughter, musical performances she'd been too afraid to imagine, and heartfelt letters exchanged with new friends and survivors across the country. Each moment of connection, each step toward opening up about her experience, slowly transformed her pain into a source of strength. The role of family, faith, and community. Central to Elizabeth's recovery was her family, who supported her unconditionally and learned alongside her. Ed and Lois Smart threw themselves into research, connecting with experts and other survivor families. They brought in support groups, engaged their faith community, and sought out activities that restored normalcy as best they could. The Smarts' faith, previously tested but never abandoned, became a gentle undercurrent in their daily routine. Prayer, music, and quiet rituals provided Elizabeth a sense of continuity and hope. Community, too, played a paradoxical role. On one hand, the Smart neighborhood became a buffer zone, with neighbors offering protection and practical support. Yet public interest was constant, a double-edged sword. The outpouring of sympathy sustained the family, yet sometimes made it difficult for Elizabeth to move through the world without fear of recognition or invasive curiosity. Over time, carefully managed exposure, controlled public appearances, letters, and selective interviews helped Elizabeth shape the narrative and take back her own story. Her family's advocacy spilled over into public service. The Smarts, drawing on their own lessons, began working with legislative agencies, survivor networks, and trauma experts to improve resources for other missing children and their families. Gradually, the roles changed. Elizabeth was not simply a rescued victim, but an author of hope and possibility for others. From trauma to advocacy, finding her voice. Elizabeth's greatest transformation lay in her ability to find purpose amid adversity. As she grew stronger, her desire to make meaning out of suffering grew. Music, which had always been a refuge for Elizabeth, became both therapy and testimony. She returned to the harp, eventually performing publicly in a series of carefully chosen engagements, channeling emotion that words sometimes failed to contain. Her journey gained new dimension as she began to speak out, first in written statements, then in controlled interviews, and finally, as an advocate on national platforms. Elizabeth Smart founded a non-profit dedicated to supporting recovery for survivors of abuse and abduction, and she consulted with lawmakers seeking to improve missing children protocols and services. With poise and candor, she gave a face and a voice to the often invisible world of trauma survivors. Elizabeth's approach to advocacy was grounded in compassion and authenticity. She refused to let her story be limited to fear and victimization. Instead, she shared her strategies for resilience and healing. In interviews and appearances, she emphasized the importance of hope, the value of professional therapy, and the unwavering support survivors need from loved ones and society. Long-term impact and inspiring others. Elizabeth's path was not always linear. Years after her rescue, she still managed the aftershocks, anxiety in public spaces, sensitivity to news about other abductions, and the ever-present possibility of being recognized at awkward or vulnerable moments. But these challenges became catalysts for deeper empathy. By choosing to share her struggles and victories, she inspired others, not only other survivors but anyone grappling with guilt, shame, loss, or the need to start over after trauma. Her memoir, public talks, and educational efforts reached millions. Elizabeth's willingness to speak about the details of psychological recovery, about nightmares, about family arguments, about the slow and sometimes painful rediscovery of joy, lifted a veil for many. For law enforcement and medical professionals, her insights prompted new approaches to survivor care, emphasizing trauma-informed protocols and survivor agency. For everyday people, her resilience was proof that hope was not naive or passive, but an active force, something to be cultivated, one decision and one day at a time. The narrative of Elizabeth Smart's extraordinary survival and her ongoing recovery became a touchstone for a generation. She helped change the way the nation talks about trauma, recovery, and hope. More than an inspiration, Elizabeth became an advocate for human dignity, refusing to let her worst days define her, and urging everyone to do the same, even in the shadow of unimaginable adversity. The trial, its aftermath, and the enduring message of Elizabeth Smart. From the moment Elizabeth Smart was rescued, the focus turned to justice and closure, not only for her family, but for an entire nation shaken by the ordeal. The legal process that followed was unprecedented in its complexity and emotional intensity, and its ripples extended far beyond the courtroom. For months, all eyes were on Salt Lake City as the details of Elizabeth's captivity, her resilience, and the crimes of Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee unfolded under public scrutiny. The legal journey began almost immediately after Elizabeth's return. The evidence was overwhelming: witness testimony, physical evidence, and, crucially, Elizabeth's own harrowing account. However, the prosecution faced numerous challenges. Brian David Mitchell's mental state was an early point of contention. The defense built its case around claims of insanity, arguing that Mitchell's actions were guided by religious delusions so overwhelming that he could not distinguish right from wrong. Psychiatric evaluations, expert testimonies, and drawn-out hearings ensued. The court system, already under pressure to deliver justice, now had to carefully navigate between public demand for accountability and the ethical standards owed to all defendants, even those accused of horrifying acts. Elizabeth's involvement in the trial was marked by her extraordinary poise. Despite the trauma she'd endured, she agreed to testify, unwavering, direct, and remarkably composed in front of her captor. She recounted details of her abduction and months of captivity. Though graphic and deeply painful, her testimony was crucial. The world watched as Elizabeth articulated the difference between mere survival and true resilience. She confronted Mitchell in court, refusing to let fear or shame dictate her narrative, her words echoing with a strength that impressed even seasoned prosecutors and judges alike. After months of legal maneuvering, and despite the defense's argument, the jury found Brian David Mitchell guilty of kidnapping and sexual assault. The judge sentenced him to life without parole, a decisive statement that the horror inflicted on one child would not go unpunished. Wanda Barzee, who'd played a disturbing role as Mitchell's enabler and accomplice, received a 15-year federal sentence after a separate plea agreement. The sentences offered a measure of relief to the Smart family, yet it was clear that the wounds, both visible and hidden, would take a lifetime to heal. The aftermath of the trial saw a cascade of social, legal, and cultural effects. Media coverage reignited after the verdict, but this time, the narrative shifted from one solely about victimhood to a story of empowerment. Elizabeth willingly took on a new role, not as the face of trauma, but as a voice for survivors everywhere. In press conferences following the trial, she expressed both gratitude and determination, urging other victims to come forward and fight for justice. She made it clear that her journey would not begin or end with Mitchell's conviction. The impact on public policy soon became tangible. The Smart case had already helped galvanize support for improvements to the Amber Alert system and inspired state and national legislation designed to streamline interagency cooperation in missing children cases. Law enforcement agencies prioritized training in trauma-informed response and victim support, recognizing that survivors' long-term healing depended on compassionate, comprehensive care. Elizabeth's story was now woven into the changing legal landscape around advocacy for child abduction victims. Her testimony prompted further research, grants, and nonprofit work focused on prevention, recovery, and psychological support. Yet the societal reverberations extended further. Elizabeth's family, while deeply private, became committed advocates. They supported other families in crisis, contributed to educational forums, and lent their voice to public campaigns addressing not just abduction, but broader issues of resilience, faith, and collective action. Ed and Lois Smart, in particular, spoke candidly about the emotional labor required to navigate such trials, reminding the public that closure is never truly the end, but a new phase of learning to live with loss, hope, and transformation. Elizabeth herself forged a remarkable path in the years after the trial. She returned to school, excelling academically and embracing her love for music, a passion that had helped sustain her throughout captivity. She eventually graduated from college, married, and started a family of her own. All the while she became a sought-after public speaker, tackling topics from trauma recovery to faith and perseverance. Her autobiography, documentaries, and televised interviews gave millions of people insight into the realities of abduction and recovery, demystifying both trauma and healing. Perhaps one of the most striking elements of Elizabeth's post-trial life is her candor about both pain and hope. She refuses to be defined by the worst thing that happened to her. Instead, she channels her experience into advocacy, founding the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, which seeks to empower victims of abuse and abduction through prevention programs, survivor support, and legislative action. Her work with policy leaders and nonprofit organizations continues to shape how America thinks about victimhood. not as a permanent label, but as a chapter within a broader story of possibility. The message Elizabeth Smart conveys, born from the crucible of her ordeal and the spotlight of the trial, is clear and urgent. Darkness can be met with light. Fear can be challenged by the courage to speak out. She encourages others to believe in the importance of agency and faith, even after profound violation, insisting that no cycle of abuse or silence is inevitable. Her willingness to publicly recount her recovery inspires not only fellow survivors but also their families, policymakers, and even professionals in law and mental health. The world's response to the Smart case and to Elizabeth herself is a testament to how one person's tragedy and resilience can catalyze social change. On television, in books, and from the podium, her presence invites a difficult but necessary national conversation, one that confronts uncomfortable truths while offering a blueprint for survival, compassion, and reform. The lessons drawn from her journey continue to ripple outward, influencing everything from classroom discussions to legal reforms and grassroots activism. Looking back, the Smart family's determination, paired with Elizabeth's extraordinary refusal to accept victimhood, transformed one horrible event into a beacon of hope and action. The trial, though harrowing, provided lasting lessons about justice, empathy, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Elizabeth's message echoes far beyond the courtroom, that every survivor has a voice, and by raising it, not only is healing possible, but so too is the transformation of society itself. In the years since the trial, Elizabeth continues to inspire with her advocacy, compassion, and public service. Her story remains a clarion call, reminding us that out of even the deepest trauma can rise a powerful legacy, one that insists on hope, demands justice, and unites communities in the ongoing fight for safety, dignity, and healing for all.